The America We Knew, The Evolution of a Nation, written by Harry Montgomery, narrated by Cedar Reyes. Chapter 1, Foundations of a New World. Long before the United States was conceived, the land that would become America was home to diverse native nations with distinct cultures, languages, and ways of life. These indigenous peoples had established intricate societies with deep spiritual ties to the land. Their histories and traditions stretched back centuries, shaped by the environment and a rich tapestry of social and economic systems. When European settlers began arriving in the early 1600s, they encountered not an empty wilderness, but thriving civilizations. However, the arrival of these settlers would soon mark a period of upheaval and change that would drastically alter the continent's destiny. The first European settlements were often fragile, dependent on indigenous knowledge and assistance for survival. The English at Jamestown, the Pilgrims in Plymouth, and other colonial groups faced starvation, disease, and harsh climates. Over time, however, these colonies grew stronger and more permanent. As settlers established farms, towns, and trade routes, they also began to encroach upon native lands, leading to rising tensions and inevitable conflict. Colonial powers such as Britain, France, and Spain vied for control over these territories, using both diplomacy and violence to expand their influence. The early colonial period was thus characterized by both cooperation and confrontation, shaping a complex legacy of interaction between natives and newcomers. As settlements expanded, so too did European influence over the land. Colonists brought with them not only goods and technology, but also new political, religious, and economic systems. These imported ideas began to take root, forming the foundations of what would later become American governance and identity. At the same time, the enslaved labor of Africans was introduced into the colonies, creating a brutal institution that would come to define much of the nation's future struggles. The economic development of the colonies increasingly depended on plantation agriculture, trade, and the exploitation of both enslaved and indigenous peoples. Wealth began to concentrate in the hands of colonial elites, while the seeds of class and racial hierarchies were firmly planted. By the mid-1700s, the colonies had become more than distant outposts of European empires. A distinct American identity was beginning to form, shaped by experiences unique to life in the New World. People born in the colonies started to see themselves as different from their counterparts across the Atlantic. The spirit of independence, though not yet fully realized, was quietly brewing. Events like the French and Indian War would soon heighten colonial grievances, setting the stage for a break from the Old World. The foundations laid in this early period, marked by migration, conflict, cooperation, and adaptation, would ultimately give rise to a new and evolving nation. Native lands and early settlements. Before the first European ships reached the shores of North America, the land was already deeply inhabited and cultivated by Native American societies. These communities had lived for generations in harmony with the environment, shaping the land through agricultural practices, trade networks, and cultural traditions. From the dense forests of the Northeast to the deserts of the Southwest, tribes such as the Iroquois, Powhatan, Cherokee, Sioux, and Hopi thrived in complex societies. Their ways of life were deeply tied to the rhythms of nature, and their territories were clearly defined and respected among neighboring groups. The concept of land ownership differed greatly from European notions. For many tribes, the land was sacred and shared, not something to be bought or sold. The arrival of European settlers disrupted this balance. The earliest permanent English colony, Jamestown, was established in 1607 in Virginia. It was not the first attempt at settlement, but it was the first to endure. The settlers arrived with dreams of gold and trade, but they found harsh conditions, unfamiliar terrain, and limited resources. Without the assistance of local tribes like the Powhatan Confederacy, many would not have survived the first brutal winters. Relationships between settlers and native peoples were initially based on mutual need, but trust quickly eroded. Misunderstandings, cultural differences, and a hunger for land turned cooperation into conflict. Violence erupted as settlers pushed further into indigenous territories, and retaliations from native groups were met with brutal reprisals. In New England, the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth in 1620. They too relied on native help, particularly from the Wampanoag people, who taught them how to cultivate corn and survive the changing seasons. For a time, peace held between the groups. However, as more Puritans arrived in the Massachusetts Bay Colony and other settlements expanded, the pressure on native lands intensified. The settlers viewed the open forests and undeveloped lands as opportunities, often ignoring or rejecting indigenous claims to territory. Their settlements began to consume vast areas, fencing off land, and altering the landscape in irreversible ways. Diseases brought by the Europeans also devastated native populations, wiping out entire villages and weakening tribal resistance to expansion. Spanish and French colonizers had similar impacts in other regions of North America. In the Southwest, Spanish missions introduced Catholicism and European agricultural techniques to indigenous communities, often through coercion or force. In the Great Lakes and along the Mississippi River, French traders established fur trading posts, forming alliances with some tribes while disrupting older intertribal relations. Across the continent, the arrival of settlers marked the beginning of a fundamental transformation of native life. The ancient stewardship of the land gave way to a new era marked by displacement, resistance, and loss. Though many native groups fought to defend their lands and preserve their way of life, the tide of colonization proved relentless. The early settlements that dot colonial history books were founded not just by ambition and courage, but also by the disruption of ancient native homelands. These early encounters shaped the trajectory of a continent, laying the groundwork for centuries of struggle over the meaning of land, identity, and power in the America that was yet to come. Colonial dreams and realities. The colonists who journeyed to the New World came with high hopes and ambitious visions. Many were driven by dreams of wealth, land, and freedom from religious or political persecution. Pamphlets and promoters painted North America as a land of endless opportunity, where hard work would be rewarded and fortunes could be made. For some, it was an escape from poverty and rigid class systems. For others, it was a chance to build a new society based on their own ideals. These dreams fueled a wave of migrations, leading to the establishment of various colonies along the Atlantic coast, each shaped by the motivations and backgrounds of its settlers. Yet once on the ground, reality often clashed with expectation. Life in the colonies was harsh, uncertain, and marked by constant struggle. Many settlers were unprepared for the challenges of clearing forests, building shelters, and surviving unfamiliar climates. Disease, hunger, and conflict were common in the early years. In Jamestown, the promise of gold proved elusive, and only after years of suffering did tobacco cultivation emerge as a profitable enterprise. In New England, religious communities sought to create godly societies, but internal divisions and external threats made stability difficult. The utopian ideals of brotherhood and equality often gave way to rigid hierarchies and social tensions as the colonies matured. Colonial economies evolved to match the demands of survival and profit. In the South, plantation agriculture became the foundation of wealth, relying heavily on enslaved labor. This not only shaped the economy, but deeply influenced the region's social structure. In the North, smaller farms, fishing, shipbuilding, and trade created a more diverse economy, though wealth was still unequally distributed. Meanwhile, the Middle colonies developed into centers of commerce and agriculture, known for their relative tolerance and cultural variety. Despite these differences, all colonies operated under European imperial systems, answering to the political and economic interests of their respective crowns. Colonial leaders were often caught between loyalty to the mother country and the growing desire for self-governance. Daily life in the colonies was shaped by class, gender, and race. The elites controlled most of the land and wealth, while laborers, indentured servants, and slaves carried the burdens of production. Women's roles were largely confined to the household, though their work was vital to survival. Enslaved Africans were brought in growing numbers, especially in the South, and their forced labor became central to colonial prosperity. Native Americans were steadily pushed out or killed, their resistance met with military force and treaty betrayals. These harsh realities undermined the romantic image of the colonies as places of liberty and opportunity. Over time, a unique colonial culture began to form, blending European traditions with the necessities and experiences of life in the Americas. This emerging identity was marked by resilience, adaptability, and a growing sense of separation from European authority. While the colonial dream was never fully realized for many, it laid the foundation for the evolving notion of American identity. The struggle to reconcile ideals with realities would continue to shape the political and social landscape, eventually leading the colonies toward a path of revolution and independence. The story of early colonial America, then, is not one of unbroken triumph, but of continuous negotiation between hope and hardship. Seeds of rebellion. As the American colonies matured, tensions began to grow beneath the surface of daily life. Though many colonists still identified as loyal subjects of the British Crown, their experiences in the New World were beginning to forge a different mindset. The vast distances from Europe, the hardships of frontier living, and the increasing complexity of colonial economies all contributed to a sense of independence. Colonists had built towns, established trade routes, and developed their own institutions. They were used to managing their affairs with minimal interference, and when Britain began to assert greater control, many felt the intrusion as both unjust and unwelcome. One of the first major sparks of discontent came from Britain's attempts to recover the costs of the French and Indian War. That conflict, which had ended in 1763, had been fought largely on American soil and had involved colonial militias. While it secured British dominance in North America, it left the empire deeply in debt. To help pay for the war, Parliament passed a series of taxes aimed at the colonies. Measures like the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and later the Townshend Acts ignited outrage among colonists who believed these taxes were imposed without proper representation. The slogan, "No taxation without representation," captured the growing resentment, as colonists insisted that only their elected assemblies had the authority to levy taxes. Protests erupted in cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. Colonial newspapers spread revolutionary ideas and criticized British policy. Merchants organized boycotts of British goods, and groups like the Sons of Liberty used both rhetoric and intimidation to rally opposition. The colonies were not united in these efforts. Many remained loyal to the Crown, but the groundwork for a broader resistance was being laid. The Stamp Act was eventually repealed, but the sense of betrayal lingered. Each new attempt by Britain to assert authority only deepened the colonists' suspicions and resistance. Violence further escalated tensions. In 1770, British soldiers fired into a crowd of colonists in what became known as the Boston Massacre. Though only a few were killed, the event was seized upon by colonial leaders as evidence of tyranny. Pamphlets and engravings dramatized the incident, fueling anti-British sentiment. A few years later, in response to the Tea Act, which many saw as an attempt to enforce unfair trade practices, Boston rebels staged the infamous Boston Tea Party, dumping an entire shipment of British tea into the harbor. The British government responded with harsh penalties through the Coercive Acts, which colonists called the Intolerable Acts. These punitive laws only strengthened resistance and led to the formation of the First Continental Congress. By the early 1770s, rebellion was no longer a distant possibility, but a looming reality. Colonial leaders were gathering to discuss collective action, and militias were beginning to organize and train. What had begun as disputes over taxes and trade had grown into a deeper struggle over power, rights, and identity. The seeds of rebellion had taken root in the soil of discontent, nurtured by years of conflict and a growing conviction that a new path must be forged. Though war had not yet begun, the colonies were now poised on the brink of revolution. Chapter 2: Revolution and Independence. The movement toward revolution did not erupt overnight, but built steadily from a series of grievances and confrontations between Britain and its American colonies. What began as protests against taxation and trade regulation evolved into a broader conflict over authority, rights, and self-governance. As Parliament continued to pass laws tightening control over the colonies, Americans began to question the legitimacy of British rule. Political leaders, writers, and common citizens debated ideas of liberty, natural rights, and the role of government. The growing unrest united colonies that had once seen themselves as separate, setting the stage for a shared cause and a collective struggle for independence. By 1775, the situation had reached a boiling point. British troops were stationed in several colonies to enforce the king's laws, creating daily tensions with the local population. When British soldiers attempted to seize colonial arms in Concord, Massachusetts, they were met with armed resistance. The battles of Lexington and Concord marked the beginning of open conflict. Colonial militias, now calling themselves the Continental Army, rallied under the leadership of George Washington. Though they lacked formal training and supplies, their determination was fueled by a belief in the justice of their cause. The war had begun, but many still hoped for reconciliation with Britain. That hope began to fade as the fighting intensified. In 1776, Thomas Paine published Common Sense, a fiery pamphlet that argued for complete independence and denounced monarchy as unnatural and oppressive. His words resonated widely, shifting public opinion in favor of breaking ties with Britain. That same year, the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia and, after intense debate, approved the Declaration of Independence. Drafted primarily by Thomas Jefferson, the document laid out the philosophical foundation for the new nation, asserting that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights. On July 4, 1776, the United States of America was officially proclaimed, though the war for its survival was far from over. The struggle for independence was long and grueling. British forces were powerful, well-trained, and well-equipped. The Americans, on the other hand, had to rely on irregular militias, foreign aid, and the resilience of local communities. Key battles at Saratoga, Trenton, and Yorktown defined the course of the war. The turning point came with the victory at Saratoga in 1777, which convinced France to join the war as an American ally. French military and financial support proved critical. In 1781, the combined American and French forces trapped the British Army at Yorktown, forcing a surrender that effectively ended major combat. The Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, officially recognizing American independence and granting the new nation control over territory stretching from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River. The revolution had succeeded, but it had come at great cost. Thousands had died, communities had been divided, and the economy was in shambles. Yet the spirit of independence endured. The war had forged a new identity and laid the foundation for a republic rooted in the ideals of freedom and democracy. The revolution was not only a military victory, but a radical reimagining of government and society, one that would shape the future of the nation and influence movements around the world. The struggle against empire. The American colonists did not initially seek to destroy the British Empire. For decades, they had seen themselves as loyal subjects of the crown, proud of their place in an empire that spanned the globe. But as Britain tightened its grip over the colonies, using taxation, trade restrictions, and military presence to assert control, Many colonists began to feel that their rights were being violated. They had no representatives in Parliament and no say in the laws that governed their lives. What began as a defense of traditional English liberties slowly evolved into a revolutionary cause. The struggle against the empire was not just a political rebellion, but a battle over identity, power, and the future of governance. The events following the French and Indian War in 1763 played a crucial role in reshaping colonial attitudes. Britain's need to pay off war debts led to a wave of revenue-generating policies that directly impacted the colonies. The Sugar Act, Stamp Act, and Townshend Acts were all perceived as unjust impositions. Though Parliament insisted it had the authority to legislate for all British subjects, the colonists argued that taxation without representation was tyranny. Petitions and protests were ignored or dismissed, and the British government responded with force. The presence of troops in cities like Boston only heightened tensions and gave colonists a sense of occupation rather than protection. As conflict grew, colonial leaders began to organize more seriously. The Continental Congress was formed as a way to coordinate resistance and present a united front. Initially, many hoped that diplomacy could resolve the crisis, but repeated attempts at negotiation were met with rejection. The king's refusal to address the colonies' concerns convinced many that the empire no longer had their interests at heart. Meanwhile, armed clashes like those at Lexington and Concord in 1775 transformed political debate into open warfare. The struggle was now not only about representation, but about the right to self-rule and freedom from imperial domination. The colonists faced a daunting challenge. Britain had the most powerful military in the world and a vast global network of resources. The American forces, by contrast, were poorly equipped, loosely organized, and lacking in training. Still, they had advantages: a knowledge of the terrain, the ability to mobilize local support, and a cause that inspired determination and sacrifice. The revolutionaries framed their struggle as a moral and philosophical battle, emphasizing the rights of individuals and the illegitimacy of rule by distant monarchs. This language of liberty gave the movement a unifying and energizing force, attracting supporters across the colonies and abroad. As the war progressed, the struggle became more than a political break. It became a fight to prove that ordinary people could govern themselves. Victory was far from certain, and many hardships tested the commitment of the revolutionaries. But their resistance to empire was about more than independence. It was about building something new in its place. By 1783, when Britain finally recognized American sovereignty, the colonists had done more than defeat a king's army. They had dismantled the authority of one of the world's most powerful empires and begun the difficult task of constructing a republic grounded in principles of liberty, representation, and civic responsibility. Declaration and Defiance. By the summer of 1776, the American colonies stood at a crossroads. After years of political turmoil, protests, and bloodshed, the desire for reconciliation with Britain had faded. The battles of Lexington and Concord, followed by Bunker Hill, had made it clear that the conflict was no longer a matter of isolated resistance. A full-scale war was underway, and the time had come to decide whether to remain loyal to the crown or to commit to the creation of a new, independent nation. The idea of severing ties with Britain was bold, even dangerous, but it had become a necessary step for many who believed the colonies could no longer live under imperial rule. The Continental Congress, assembled in Philadelphia, had taken on the enormous responsibility of representing the colonies as a unified body. The debates within the Congress were intense and emotional. Some delegates still held out hope for a peaceful resolution, while others were convinced that independence was the only viable path forward. Influential voices like John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and Richard Henry Lee argued in favor of taking action. Meanwhile, the publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense had reached a wide audience, inspiring ordinary Americans with its forceful argument that monarchy was unnatural and oppressive, and that the colonies had the moral right to break free. On June 7, 1776, Lee introduced a resolution to declare independence. A committee was quickly formed to draft a formal statement. Thomas Jefferson, known for his eloquence and clarity of thought, took the lead in writing what would become the Declaration of Independence. Drawing on Enlightenment ideas, particularly those of John Locke, Jefferson asserted that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration also laid out a long list of grievances against King George III, portraying him as a tyrant who had violated the rights of the colonies and lost his legitimacy as a ruler. The document was approved on July 4, 1776, marking a momentous turning point. The Declaration of Independence was not only a legal and political document, it was a statement of defiance and a call to action. It gave the revolutionary movement a clear purpose and unified the colonies under a shared cause. It also served as a powerful message to the world, particularly to France and other European powers, that the colonies were no longer part of Britain and sought alliances as an independent nation. The risk was immense. Those who signed the document were committing treason in the eyes of the Crown and faced execution if captured. Despite the danger, the Declaration became a rallying symbol for American forces and supporters of the Revolution. Its ideals would be echoed in town meetings, sermons, and printed broadsides across the land. Though the realities of war and the limitations of early American society often fell short of the lofty words written on that parchment, the Declaration laid the ideological foundation for the new nation. In declaring their independence, the colonists were not only rejecting British rule, they were embracing a radical vision of government by the people, setting in motion a struggle that would shape the identity of the United States for generations to come. Building a new government. With independence declared and the war still raging, the American colonies faced the daunting task of creating a government from scratch. The break from Britain was not just a rejection of a monarch, but a rejection of monarchy itself. The Founding Fathers had to design a system that would reflect the ideals of liberty and representation, while also functioning effectively in a vast and diverse land. The fear of concentrated power loomed large. Having just escaped what they saw as tyranny, Americans were determined to prevent any new form of despotism from taking hold. This mindset would shape the early structures of governance and define the early republic's foundational principles. The first attempt at national government came with the Articles of Confederation, adopted in 1777 and ratified by the states in 1781. This document created a loose confederation of sovereign states with a weak central authority. The Articles reflected deep mistrust of centralized power by limiting the federal government's ability to tax, regulate trade, or enforce laws. Each state had one vote in Congress, regardless of size or population, and most decisions required a supermajority. There was no executive branch, no national judiciary, and no president. While this system kept power close to the people and their state governments, it soon proved inadequate for managing the challenges of war and post-war recovery. As the Revolutionary War came to an end, it became clear that the government under the Articles could not meet the needs of the new nation. Economic turmoil, interstate disputes, and the inability to raise funds or maintain a standing army exposed the weaknesses of the Confederation. Events like Shays' Rebellion, a farmer-led uprising in Massachusetts over debt and taxation, highlighted the fragility of the system and the need for a stronger national framework. Leaders across the states began to call for reform, and in 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia for what would become the Constitutional Convention. The Constitutional Convention was a turning point. While it was originally convened to revise the Articles, it soon became clear that a completely new system was needed. The delegates, among them George Washington, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton, engaged in fierce debates over the balance of power between large and small states, between the federal government and the states, and among the three proposed branches of government. Out of these debates came the United States Constitution, a bold new blueprint that divided power among the legislative, executive, and judicial branches and established checks and balances to guard against tyranny. The Constitution was signed in September 1787, but it still required ratification by the states. This sparked intense public debate, with supporters, known as Federalists, arguing that the new government was necessary for unity and stability. Opponents, the Anti-Federalists, feared the potential for abuse and demanded stronger protections for individual rights. To address these concerns, the Bill of Rights, 10 amendments guaranteeing key freedoms, was added in 1791. With these assurances, the Constitution gained widespread acceptance. The creation of the Constitution marked the beginning of a new era in American political life. It established the framework for a government that, while imperfect and subject to change, would endure and evolve over centuries. The founders had built a government rooted in compromise and principle, one that sought to balance freedom with order and set a precedent for democratic governance around the world. Chapter 3: Growth and Division. In the years following independence, the United States experienced rapid expansion and transformation. New territories were added, cities began to grow, and a wave of technological and economic changes swept across the nation. The promise of opportunity drew settlers westward, while the expanding economy created both prosperity and unrest. However, with this growth came deepening divisions. Differences in regional interests, economic systems, and views on slavery threatened to undermine the fragile unity of the young nation. As the country advanced, the tension between progress and inequality became increasingly difficult to ignore. One of the driving forces behind this period of growth was the acquisition of new land. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 doubled the size of the country, opening vast stretches of territory for settlement. Lewis and Clark's expedition helped map the new frontier and inspired dreams of a continental nation. The ideology of manifest destiny, which held that Americans were destined to expand across the continent, gained traction and justified further territorial claims. As pioneers moved west, they encountered resistance from Native American tribes, whose lands were increasingly encroached upon. These encounters often led to violent conflict and forced displacement, highlighting the darker side of American expansion. The Industrial Revolution also played a key role in reshaping American society. In the North, factories and mills began to dominate the landscape, bringing with them a rise in wage labor, urbanization, and transportation networks such as canals and railroads. In the South, however, the economy remained largely agrarian, driven by cotton plantations that relied heavily on enslaved labor. The invention of the cotton gin made cotton production more profitable and increased the demand for slaves. This economic divergence between North and South created stark contrasts in social structure, political priorities, and visions for the country's future. As the economy evolved, so too did the political landscape. Debates over tariffs, banking policies, and the role of the federal government became flashpoints for conflict. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 was an early attempt to manage the growing sectional divide by balancing the interests of free and slave states. However, such compromises only delayed deeper conflicts. Tensions over slavery, states' rights, and federal authority continued to build, with each new territory or state added to the Union bringing renewed debates over its status as free or slaveholding. The political system struggled to contain the mounting discord. Social movements also began to gain strength during this time. In the North, abolitionists worked to end slavery and promote civil rights for African Americans. Reformers called for temperance, better education, and women's suffrage. These efforts were met with both support and fierce opposition, reflecting the nation's divided conscience. While the ideals of liberty and equality had fueled the founding of the Republic, they were increasingly tested by the realities of inequality and injustice. The era of growth and division was marked by contradiction. The United States was expanding its territory and influence, yet becoming more fractured internally. The same forces that propelled the nation forward also exposed its deepest faults. As Americans pursued new opportunities and forged a national identity, they also sowed the seeds of conflict that would later erupt in civil war. The dream of unity remained alive, but it was becoming more difficult to maintain as the nation grew in size, complexity, and disparity. Westward expansion and conflict. As the 19th century unfolded, the United States looked westward with growing ambition. The vast lands beyond the Mississippi River promised fertile soil, natural resources, and a chance to fulfill what many Americans believed was their destiny: to extend the nation from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This belief, known as manifest destiny, became a driving force behind national policy and personal dreams alike. It was an idea rooted in optimism, nationalism, and a sense of divine purpose, but its pursuit would lead to numerous conflicts, both within and beyond the nation's borders. The expansion brought opportunity for some, devastation for others, and increasingly divided the country on critical issues. The Louisiana Purchase had opened the floodgates of migration, and by the 1820s and 1830s, settlers were pouring into newly acquired territories. The government encouraged this movement through land acts, surveys, and treaties that often undermined or ignored the rights of indigenous peoples. Native American tribes, who had lived on these lands for generations, were forcibly removed through a series of policies that culminated in tragedies like the Trail of Tears. Entire communities were uprooted and relocated to designated Indian territory, often with little regard for their well-being or survival. Resistance was met with military force, and native cultures were systematically disrupted as the frontier advanced. Expansion also led to conflict with foreign powers. The annexation of Texas, which had declared independence from Mexico, led directly to the Mexican-American War in 1846. The war was framed as a response to border disputes, but it was largely driven by the desire to acquire more territory. The conflict ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ceded a vast portion of Mexican land, including California, Arizona, New Mexico, and more, to the United States. While it fulfilled the dream of a coast-to-coast nation, it also raised intense debates over whether these new territories would allow slavery. Each new addition to the map reopened the question of sectional balance and fueled tensions between the North and South. Life on the frontier was often harsh and uncertain. Settlers faced threats from the environment, isolation, and sometimes from native tribes resisting further encroachment. Still, the promise of land ownership and independence drove many to take the risk. Towns sprang up, railroads were built, and the landscape was rapidly transformed. The government played a key role in shaping this growth, funding infrastructure, and passing laws that supported expansion. At the same time, the displacement of native populations continued, often justified by the notion that progress demanded sacrifice. Westward expansion embodied the spirit of American possibility, but it came at significant cost. It intensified the divisions that would eventually tear the country apart. Slavery, sovereignty, and the treatment of indigenous peoples became central moral and political issues. For every settler who found prosperity, there were others, especially among native communities, who lost their land, their homes, and their lives. The frontier became both a symbol of national greatness and a battlefield of unresolved contradictions. The promise of the West, though bright in the minds of many, cast a long shadow over the nation's conscience, one that would grow darker as conflict deepened in the years ahead. The rise of industry. The early 19th century marked a period of profound transformation in the United States as the economy shifted from a primarily agrarian base to one increasingly driven by industrialization. This dramatic change, often referred to as the Industrial Revolution in America, altered nearly every aspect of daily life. Fueled by technological innovation, access to capital, and a growing labor force, industry began to thrive, particularly in the northeastern states. The rise of factories, mechanized production, and mass transportation redefined how goods were made, how people worked, and how communities functioned. With it came both economic opportunity and social upheaval, making industry a powerful but divisive force in American development. One of the key developments was the spread of textile mills, which became the backbone of early American manufacturing. Powered by water and later by steam, these mills allowed goods to be produced faster and more cheaply than ever before. Towns like Lowell, Massachusetts, became industrial centers, employing thousands, including many young women who left farms to work in the mills. Their wages, though low, offered a measure of independence, but working conditions were harsh and hours long. As industry expanded, so did the need for labor. Immigrants, particularly from Ireland and Germany, flooded into cities in search of work, changing the cultural makeup of urban America and fueling tensions with native-born citizens. Transportation also played a vital role in industrial growth. The construction of canals, such as the Erie Canal, opened up new markets by connecting inland areas to coastal ports. Railroads soon surpassed canals in speed and reach, linking cities and rural regions across the country. These networks allowed raw materials like coal, iron, and cotton to be transported efficiently to factories and finished products to reach distant consumers. The telegraph, another major innovation, revolutionized communication, allowing business decisions to be made and information to be shared at unprecedented speed. Together, these technologies created a national economy where goods, money, and ideas flowed more freely than ever before. As factories and cities grew, so did new challenges. Industrialization brought wealth to entrepreneurs and investors, but also widened the gap between rich and poor. Urban workers often lived in overcrowded tenements, facing disease, crime, and pollution. Child labor was common, and laborers had little protection from dangerous working conditions. These hardships gave rise to early labor movements as workers began to organize strikes and unions to demand better treatment. Their efforts were often met with resistance from factory owners and government officials who feared economic disruption. While the North industrialized rapidly, the South remained largely agricultural, relying on slave labor and plantation economies. This divide further intensified sectional differences, not just economically, but socially and politically. The rise of industry underscored the competing visions for America's future, one built on free labor and innovation, the other on slavery and traditional hierarchies. These tensions would continue to grow, contributing to the larger conflict that eventually erupted into civil war. The rise of industry transformed the United States into a more modern and interconnected society. It created new possibilities for wealth and mobility while exposing the contradictions of American progress. Industry would become both a symbol of national strength and a catalyst for ongoing struggles over equality, labor, and the meaning of the American dream. Slavery and sectional tensions. As the United States expanded and industrialized, the issue of slavery became the most divisive and explosive conflict in the nation. The institution of slavery had existed since the colonial era, but as the country grew, so did the divide between those who defended it and those who sought its abolition. In the South, slavery was deeply embedded in the economy, social structure, and political identity. Cotton plantations relied heavily on enslaved labor, and the wealth of the region was built on the backs of millions of enslaved African Americans. In contrast, the North moved increasingly toward a free labor system with growing urban populations, factories, and wage work. These differences created a deep and widening chasm that would soon threaten the unity of the entire nation. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 revolutionized Southern agriculture by making cotton production vastly more profitable. As demand for cotton grew in both domestic and foreign markets, the South doubled down on its reliance on enslaved labor. By the mid-19th century, slavery had become not just an economic system, but a way of life, defended by Southern leaders as essential to their prosperity and culture. Slaveholders portrayed slavery as a positive good, arguing that it was sanctioned by religion, history, and even the Constitution. Any challenge to the system was met with fierce resistance, as Southerners feared that losing slavery would destroy their economic foundation and social order. In the North, opposition to slavery took many forms. While not all Northerners were abolitionists, a growing number viewed slavery as morally wrong or economically outdated. Abolitionist voices, including those of Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, and Harriet Beecher Stowe, began to sway public opinion. The publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852, for instance, brought the horrors of slavery into the homes of many Northern readers and sparked widespread outrage. At the same time, free Black communities and escaped slaves played a critical role in organizing resistance, supporting the Underground Railroad, and advocating for civil rights. Political compromises attempted to manage the growing conflict. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 were all efforts to maintain a balance between free and slave states, as new territories were added to the Union. These measures, however, only delayed the inevitable. Each new law seemed to deepen sectional hostility. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, in particular, led to violent clashes in what became known as Bleeding Kansas, as pro- and anti-slavery settlers fought for control of the territory. The nation was drifting toward a crisis it could no longer avoid. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 was the final breaking point. Though Lincoln had promised not to interfere with slavery where it already existed, his opposition to its expansion convinced Southern leaders that their way of life was under threat. One by one, Southern states began to secede from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. What had begun as political disagreement had transformed into an existential struggle. Slavery, once considered a regional issue, had become the central moral and political dilemma of the American Republic. The sectional tensions that had simmered for decades were now set to erupt into full-scale war. Chapter 4: War and Reconstruction. The Civil War was the bloodiest and most destructive conflict in American history. What began as a struggle over the future of slavery soon escalated into a war for the survival of the Union itself. Tensions between the North and South had reached a breaking point, and when Southern states seceded after Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860, war became inevitable. The Confederacy was born out of the desire to preserve the institution of slavery, while the Union fought to preserve the nation and end the threat posed by secession. The conflict would rage for 4 years, from 1861 to 1865, causing over 600,000 deaths and leaving the country deeply scarred. The war was fought on many fronts, but the most decisive battles occurred in the Southern states, where the Confederate Army sought to defend its territory and maintain control of its way of life. Early in the conflict, the Confederacy seemed to have the upper hand, with strong military leadership under generals like Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. However, the Union had significant advantages, particularly in resources, industrial capacity, and population. The North's superior infrastructure, including its railroads and factories, allowed it to outproduce the South, and its larger population provided a more sustainable manpower base. The war also transformed into a moral struggle. Initially, Lincoln's primary goal was to preserve the Union, not to abolish slavery. However, as the war dragged on and the human cost mounted, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, declaring all slaves in Confederate-held territory to be free. This shifted the focus of the war to include the abolition of slavery as a key objective. The proclamation also allowed African Americans to enlist in the Union Army, giving them an opportunity to fight for their freedom and for the future of the nation. This move further solidified the war's moral imperative and rallied abolitionists in the North. The conflict came to a head in 1865 with the surrender of Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. While smaller battles continued, this marked the end of the Confederacy and the beginning of a new chapter in American history. The Union had been preserved, but at great cost. The question of what to do with the Southern states and how to rebuild the nation posed a monumental challenge. Reconstruction began almost immediately after the war ended. The federal government faced the daunting task of reintegrating the Southern states into the Union, rebuilding the South's war-torn infrastructure, and addressing the status of former slaves. President Lincoln had envisioned a lenient Reconstruction plan that would quickly bring the South back into the fold, but his assassination in April 1865 left the task to his successor, Andrew Johnson. Johnson's more lenient approach was met with resistance in Congress, leading to a struggle between the executive and legislative branches over how to handle Reconstruction. Congress eventually passed the Reconstruction Acts, which divided the South into military districts and required Southern states to ratify the 14th and 15th Amendments, granting citizenship and voting rights to African Americans. While Reconstruction brought significant changes, including the establishment of schools and institutions for freedmen, it was also met with violent resistance from white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. By the end of the 1870s, Reconstruction had largely ended, and the South had reverted to a system of racial segregation and disenfranchisement, setting the stage for nearly another century of racial injustice. The Civil War and Reconstruction left an indelible mark on the United States. The Union was preserved, slavery was abolished, and the nation was forced to confront the challenges of integrating millions of freed slaves into society. Yet, the deep divisions exposed by the war would continue to shape American politics, culture, and identity for generations to come. The legacy of the Civil War is still felt today, as the struggle for racial equality remains an ongoing battle. The Civil War unfolds. The Civil War began in April 1861, when Confederate forces fired upon the Union garrison at Fort Sumter, South Carolina. This attack marked the start of the most destructive conflict the United States had ever seen. What had been simmering for decades, the sectional differences between the North and South, finally erupted into full-scale war. At its heart, the conflict was about the preservation of the Union and the future of slavery. The South, led by the Confederate States of America under President Jefferson Davis, sought independence to protect its way of life, which was built on the institution of slavery. The North, under President Abraham Lincoln, fought to preserve the Union and eventually to end slavery. In the early days of the war, both sides were confident of victory. The South believed its superior military leadership, especially generals like Robert E. Lee and Thomas Stonewall Jackson, would lead them to success. The North, with its larger population, industrial power, and resources, was convinced it would be able to crush the rebellion. However, neither side anticipated the length and brutality of the war. The first major battle, the First Battle of Bull Run, also known as First Manassas, took place in July 1861. Union forces, expecting an easy victory, were soundly defeated by the Confederates. This early loss shocked the North and served as a wake-up call about the seriousness of the conflict. The South, on the other hand, believed it had the upper hand after this victory. However, as the war continued, it became clear that the conflict would be long and costly, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. One of the key turning points came in 1863. In the summer, the Union achieved two significant victories that would shift the balance of the war. At the Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, Union forces under General George Meade decisively defeated Lee's Confederate Army, marking the first major defeat for the South and halting their invasion of the North. The Union victory at Gettysburg, combined with the fall of Vicksburg, Mississippi, to General Ulysses S. Grant, gave the Union control of the Mississippi River, effectively splitting the Confederacy in two and weakening its ability to sustain the war effort. Despite these defeats, the South continued to resist fiercely. Lee's army remained a formidable force, and many battles were fought in the South, where Confederates had the advantage of fighting on their own soil. However, the Confederacy was increasingly strained. The North's industrial economy allowed it to produce weapons, supplies, and war materials at an unmatchable rate, while the South's agricultural economy struggled to support the war effort. The Union's naval blockade of Southern ports further crippled the Confederacy's ability to trade cotton for supplies. The war also took on an increasingly moral dimension. In 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared all slaves in Confederate-held territory to be free. While this executive order did not immediately free all enslaved people, it changed the character of the war, turning it into a struggle not only for the Union, but also for the abolition of slavery. The proclamation also allowed African Americans to join the Union Army, and their contribution proved invaluable in the eventual victory. As the war dragged on, it became clear that neither side could easily achieve a decisive victory. The war would continue for 2 more years, with heavy losses on both sides, before General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865. The Confederacy, shattered and defeated, had no choice but to yield, bringing an end to the war. The Civil War reshaped the United States in profound ways. It preserved the Union and led to the abolition of slavery, but it also left the nation deeply divided and scarred. The war's brutal toll and the loss of life would resonate for generations, and the question of how to heal the nation and address the legacies of slavery would continue to challenge the United States for decades to come. Emancipation and aftermath. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued by President Abraham Lincoln on January 1, 1863, was a pivotal moment in the Civil War and in the history of the United States. This executive order declared that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were to be set free. While the proclamation did not immediately free all enslaved individuals, particularly in Union-controlled areas, it marked a fundamental shift in the goals of the war. What had begun as a conflict to preserve the Union had now become a war to end slavery. The proclamation also had a strategic impact, weakening the Confederacy by depriving it of labor and undermining its economy. It also gave the Union cause a moral clarity that resonated both domestically and internationally. The Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery outright, as it applied only to areas in rebellion and not to slave states that remained loyal to the Union, such as Maryland, Delaware, and Kentucky. However, it set the stage for the eventual abolition of slavery across the entire country. The proclamation gave new momentum to the abolitionist movement and encouraged many enslaved people to escape and seek freedom behind Union lines. It also allowed for the enlistment of African American soldiers in the Union Army, and over 180,000 African Americans would serve in the military by the war's end. Their participation in the fight for freedom became a symbol of both resistance and hope. Despite the proclamation's significance, the war raged on for 2 more years, with both the Union and Confederate forces suffering heavy losses. The South, already under strain from Union blockades, internal dissent, and the loss of enslaved labor, faced increasing hardships as Union armies pushed deeper into Southern territory. In the North, the war also took a toll on the population, both in terms of military casualties and the economic costs of maintaining a prolonged conflict. By 1865, the Union Army, under the leadership of General Ulysses S. Grant, had begun to break the Confederacy's defenses. In April 1865, the Confederacy's military resistance came to an end with the surrender of General Robert E. Lee to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The war had taken its toll on both sides, leaving the South devastated and the nation divided. Over 600,000 Americans had died, and much of the Southern landscape had been destroyed. The question of how to reunite the nation and rebuild the South would become the next great challenge for the United States. Reconstruction, The process of rebuilding the South and integrating the formerly Confederate states back into the Union began immediately after the war's end. President Lincoln had proposed a lenient plan that would allow Southern states to rejoin the Union once 10% of their voters swore an oath of allegiance. However, with Lincoln's assassination in April 1865, his successor, Andrew Johnson, took a more conciliatory approach, which clashed with the more radical Republican members of Congress. Reconstruction became a time of political struggle between the executive and legislative branches over how to handle the Southern states and ensure that the rights of newly freed African Americans were protected. The aftermath of emancipation and the Civil War left the nation deeply scarred. While slavery was officially abolished by the 13th Amendment in December 1865, the legal freedom of African Americans did not immediately translate into full equality. Southern states enacted black codes to limit the rights of African Americans, and racial violence, including the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, became widespread. Reconstruction efforts failed to fully address these issues, and the country would face nearly another century of racial segregation, disenfranchisement, and discrimination before the civil rights movement of the 20th century. The Emancipation Proclamation, despite its limitations, was a transformative moment that altered the course of the war and the future of the United States. It not only ended slavery, but also set the nation on a path toward confronting the profound injustices that had been entrenched for centuries. The aftermath of emancipation, however, was marked by ongoing struggles for freedom and equality, struggles that would continue long after the war ended. Rebuilding a broken union. After the devastation of the Civil War, the United States faced the monumental challenge of rebuilding a fractured nation. The South was in ruins, its cities and infrastructure shattered, its economy in disarray, and its social structure in upheaval. The Union had been preserved, but the costs were staggering. Over 600,000 Americans had died, and millions more had been physically or psychologically scarred. The end of slavery left 4 million African Americans legally free, but they were now without land, resources, or protection. The question of how to rebuild the South, integrate formerly enslaved people into society, and repair the deep divisions between North and South loomed large. Reconstruction, the era following the Civil War, was the process through which the nation attempted to heal these wounds and reconstruct the South. President Abraham Lincoln had envisioned a relatively lenient approach to Reconstruction, aiming to quickly reintegrate the Southern states back into the Union once a small percentage of their population swore an oath of allegiance. However, Lincoln's assassination in 1865 shifted the course of Reconstruction under his successor, Andrew Johnson. Johnson's lenient policies allowed many former Confederates to regain political power, which angered radical Republicans in Congress, who believed that the South needed to be more thoroughly transformed, especially in terms of African American rights. The radical Republicans passed their own Reconstruction measures, including the Reconstruction Acts of 1867. These laws divided the South into military districts and required states to adopt new constitutions that guaranteed African American suffrage. The 14th and 15th Amendments were passed, securing citizenship and voting rights for African Americans. The presence of federal troops in the South was meant to ensure that these rights were upheld, and for a time, African Americans made significant political gains. Several African Americans were elected to state legislatures and even to Congress, marking an unprecedented period of Black political participation. However, Reconstruction faced fierce resistance from many white Southerners. Former Confederates and other white Southerners resented federal intervention and the rights granted to African Americans. In response, they formed violent white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan, which sought to intimidate, disenfranchise, and terrorize African Americans and their allies. This violence, combined with political corruption and economic instability, made the task of rebuilding the South even more difficult. The federal government struggled to effectively enforce the new laws and protect African Americans from the violence and discrimination they faced. By the 1870s, Reconstruction began to falter. The economic challenges of the South, combined with a lack of Northern support for continued military occupation, led to a gradual withdrawal of federal troops from Southern states. The Compromise of 1877, which settled the disputed 1876 presidential election, marked the end of Reconstruction. In exchange for conceding the presidency to Rutherford B. Hayes, federal troops were removed from the South and Southern states regained home rule. This marked the beginning of the Jim Crow era, a period of legalized racial segregation and disenfranchisement of African Americans that would last for nearly a century. While Reconstruction failed to fully achieve its goals of racial equality and political integration, it did lay the groundwork for future civil rights movements. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution remained in place, providing a legal foundation for the struggles to come. The legacy of Reconstruction is one of both progress and frustration. It was a time of remarkable achievements for African Americans, but also a time of intense resistance and violent backlash that set back the cause of racial equality for generations. The road to a truly rebuilt Union would be long and fraught with challenges, but the vision of a united nation, free of slavery, and built on democratic principles, continued to inspire future generations. Chapter 5: Progress and Turmoil. The late 19th century was a period of profound transformation for the United States. After the devastation of the Civil War and the difficulties of Reconstruction, the nation began to shift from an agricultural economy to one increasingly dominated by industry, urbanization, and technological innovation. The rapid pace of change brought progress, but also instability and social upheaval. As the country moved forward, it faced new challenges, including economic inequality, labor unrest, and racial tension. While the nation was expanding its power and influence, the divisions that had marked its past, between North and South, rich and poor, white and black, continued to shape the American experience. The rise of industry was one of the most significant developments of this period. New technologies like the telegraph, the railroad, and the Bessemer steel process transformed the economy. The construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, opened up the West to settlement and trade, connecting the nation from coast to coast. Major cities like New York, Chicago, and Pittsburgh became centers of industry and commerce, while small towns and rural areas faced economic decline. In the North, industrialization brought with it a growing middle class, while in the South, agriculture remained entrenched in its reliance on sharecropping and tenant farming. This industrial boom created vast fortunes for a small group of men, often referred to as robber barons, who controlled monopolies in industries such as oil, steel, and railroads. Figures like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan amassed incredible wealth, while the majority of Americans, particularly immigrant workers, labored in factories for low wages and under poor conditions. The gap between the rich and the poor grew wider, and the question of how to address this economic inequality became a key issue. The rise of industry also fueled labor unrest. Factory workers, many of whom were immigrants, faced long hours, dangerous working conditions, and low pay. As industrialization spread, workers began to organize for better wages, working hours, and conditions. Strikes and labor protests became common, though they were often met with violent suppression from both employers and the government. The Pullman Strike of 1894 and the Haymarket Affair of 1886 were among the most notable events, highlighting the growing tensions between workers and business owners. These incidents led to the rise of labor unions, though their influence was often limited by legal and political opposition. At the same time, the country struggled with racial tensions. The end of Reconstruction had brought with it the rise of Jim Crow laws, which enforced racial segregation in the South. African Americans were denied basic rights, including the right to vote, and were subjected to violence and intimidation by white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. In the North, racism still persisted, though African Americans were able to make some progress in urban areas. Figures like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois emerged as leaders in the African American community, advocating for education, civil rights, and equality. The late 19th century was also marked by the increasing influence of the United States on the world stage. The nation began to assert itself as a global power, expanding its influence through territorial acquisitions and foreign policy initiatives. The Spanish-American War of 1898, which resulted in the acquisition of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, marked the United States' emergence as an imperial power. While this expansion brought opportunities for economic growth and military prestige, it also raised questions about the nation's role in the world and its treatment of its new territories. Progress and turmoil went hand in hand in this period of American history. The nation experienced remarkable growth and innovation, but this was accompanied by social unrest, inequality, and racial division. The legacy of this time is a complicated one, shaped by both the achievements of industrialization and the struggles for justice and equality. As the United States moved into the 20th century, the questions of how to balance progress with fairness and how to address the divisions that still existed would continue to challenge the country. The Gilded Age and its challenges. The Gilded Age, a term coined by Mark Twain, was a period of significant economic growth in the United States that lasted roughly from the 1870s to the early 1900s. It was a time when the country was undergoing rapid industrialization, with major advancements in manufacturing, transportation, and technology. Cities swelled with immigrants and rural migrants seeking work in factories, and industries like steel, oil, and railroads created immense wealth for a few individuals, often referred to as robber barons. While the economy flourished, the Gilded Age was also marked by deep social and economic inequalities, political corruption, and labor unrest. At the heart of the Gilded Age was the rise of monopolies and trusts. Men like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan built vast empires in industries such as oil, steel, and finance, consolidating control over entire sectors of the economy. These business leaders accumulated enormous wealth, while their workers faced long hours, low wages, and unsafe conditions. The gap between the rich and poor widened dramatically during this time, with a growing working class and a small elite that controlled much of the nation's wealth. This disparity sparked social tension and led to calls for reform. One of the most significant challenges during the Gilded Age was the rise of labor movements. Workers began to organize in response to the harsh conditions they endured in factories, mines, and railroads. Strikes and protests, like the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 and the Haymarket Affair of 1886, highlighted the growing dissatisfaction of the working class. However, these movements were often met with violent repression from both business owners and the government, who sided with big business in the fight against labor rights. Politically, the Gilded Age was a time of widespread corruption. Political machines, like Tammany Hall in New York, controlled local governments through patronage and bribery. The federal government struggled to address the needs of the people, often prioritizing the interests of wealthy industrialists over those of the working class. This period also saw the rise of populism, as farmers and laborers began to demand reforms, including better working conditions, the regulation of big business, and the expansion of democratic rights. The Gilded Age left a lasting legacy on American society. While it saw the United States transform into a major industrial power, it also exposed the significant challenges of inequality, exploitation, and corruption that would continue to shape the nation's future. Immigration and urban life. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were a time of massive immigration to the United States, with millions of people arriving from Europe, Asia, and other parts of the world. This wave of immigration was driven by factors like poverty, religious persecution, and a desire for better opportunities. Many immigrants sought a new life in American cities, which were rapidly expanding due to industrialization. The arrival of so many people in search of work and a better life transformed the nation's urban landscape, but it also created significant social and economic challenges. Cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia became major centers of immigrant life. Immigrants often settled in ethnic enclaves, where they could find support from people who spoke their language and shared their customs. These neighborhoods, such as Little Italy and Chinatown, became vibrant hubs of cultural exchange and helped preserve immigrant traditions. However, the rapid growth of cities also led to overcrowding, inadequate housing, and poor sanitation. Many immigrants lived in tenements, small, poorly ventilated apartments, where families were packed into rooms without sufficient light, ventilation, or plumbing. The rise of industrialization also led to the growth of factories and labor unions, which played a key role in the lives of immigrants. Many new arrivals found work in the factories, mills, and railroads, often under harsh conditions and for low wages. The workforce was largely unskilled, and factory owners took advantage of the steady supply of labor by offering little in terms of benefits or protections. Strikes and labor protests became common as workers fought for better wages, working conditions, and hours. Immigrants, who made up a significant portion of the labor force, played a major role in these movements, even though they often faced resistance from both employers and the government. While cities offered economic opportunities, they also posed challenges. The influx of immigrants put a strain on public services, infrastructure, and housing. Many native-born Americans viewed immigrants with suspicion, fearing that they would take jobs and change the cultural makeup of the nation. This nativist sentiment led to the rise of anti-immigrant laws, such as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which restricted immigration from certain countries. Despite these challenges, immigrants played a crucial role in shaping the country's economic and cultural development. Over time, they helped build the nation's industrial base, contributed to the development of cities, and enriched American culture. Urban life, shaped by the experiences of immigrants, became a defining feature of American society in the modern era. Social movements rise. The late 19th and early 20th centuries in the United States were marked by significant social movements that sought to address the growing inequalities and injustices that emerged alongside industrialization and urbanization. As the country transformed into an industrial powerhouse, new social and economic problems arose, and a growing number of activists and reformers took up causes to challenge the status quo. These movements, ranging from women's suffrage to labor rights, played a crucial role in reshaping American society and laying the groundwork for future reforms. One of the most significant movements of this era was the labor movement. The rise of factories and the shift from an agricultural economy to an industrial one led to poor working conditions, long hours, and low wages for many American workers, especially in cities. Workers, many of whom were immigrants, began to organize and demand better conditions. This led to the creation of labor unions, such as the American Federation of Labor, which sought to secure rights for workers, including the right to collectively bargain, safer working conditions, and fair wages. Strikes and protests, like the Pullman strike and the Haymarket Affair, highlighted the growing tensions between workers and industrialists. While these movements faced strong opposition and often violent suppression, they laid the foundation for future labor reforms, including laws to limit child labor and improve workplace safety. Another major social movement was the women's suffrage movement. Women in the United States, particularly in the late 1800s, began to demand the right to vote and participate fully in the political process. Leaders like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton advocated for women's rights, forming organizations like the National Woman Suffrage Association. Women not only sought the vote, but also pushed for legal and social equality, including the right to own property and access to higher education. After decades of struggle and activism, the movement succeeded with the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, which granted women the right to vote. The civil rights movement also began to take shape during this period. African Americans, particularly in the South, continued to fight for equality after the end of Reconstruction and the establishment of Jim Crow laws. The formation of organizations like the NAACP in 1909 marked the beginning of more organized efforts to challenge segregation, disenfranchisement, and violence against African Americans. Though the major victories of the civil rights movement would come decades later, the groundwork for the struggle was laid during this time, with activists pushing for equal rights and justice. These social movements, though diverse in their goals, all shared a commitment to challenging the existing power structures and advocating for a more just and equitable society. They reflected the growing awareness among Americans of the need for social change and set the stage for the larger reforms of the progressive era. Chapter 6: Power and Responsibility. As the United States entered the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the country began to grapple with the responsibilities that came with newfound power. The rapid industrialization, expansion of the economy, and the growth of the nation's military and political influence marked a turning point in how the U.S. saw itself and how it was viewed by the rest of the world. The country was no longer just a fledgling democracy. It was emerging as a global power with significant influence over international affairs. However, this newfound power came with a set of challenges and moral questions about its role in the world, particularly as the U.S. began to engage more directly in global conflicts and imperialism. The Spanish-American War of 1898 was a defining moment for the United States. The war, which began over the issue of Cuban independence from Spain, resulted in a swift victory for the U.S. and marked its first major military intervention outside the Western Hemisphere. The outcome of the war led to the annexation of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, expanding American influence in the Caribbean and the Pacific. While many celebrated the acquisition of these territories as a symbol of national strength, it also raised difficult questions about imperialism, the treatment of non-white populations, and the nation's role as a global power. The debate over whether the U.S. should exert its influence abroad in a colonial manner or adhere to its founding ideals of self-determination and democracy became a central issue in American politics. At home, the rise of industrial capitalism continued to concentrate power in the hands of a few wealthy individuals and corporations. As a result, the government faced increasing pressure to regulate business practices, protect workers' rights, and ensure that the benefits of industrialization were shared more equitably. This period saw the rise of the progressive movement, which sought to address social and economic inequalities through government action. Reformers pushed for policies such as antitrust legislation, labor protections, and social welfare programs, believing that the government had a responsibility to ensure fairness and protect the most vulnerable members of society. However, as the U.S. expanded its global influence, it also had to confront its treatment of minorities within its borders. The same principles of liberty and justice that underpinned American identity were often denied to African Americans, Native Americans, and other marginalized groups. The government struggled to reconcile its democratic ideals with the realities of racial segregation, disenfranchisement, and the exploitation of indigenous populations. As the United States navigated the balance of power and responsibility, it found itself caught between the idealism of its founding principles and the complex realities of a growing empire. The nation's involvement in global affairs and the push for domestic reform highlighted the tension between power and responsibility, a tension that would continue to shape its future in the decades to come. America on the world stage. At the dawn of the 20th century, the United States began to emerge as a significant player on the global stage, a shift that was driven by both its growing economic power and its expanding military capabilities. No longer just a continental power, the U.S. began to assert its influence in international affairs, seeking to protect its interests, expand its reach, and secure its position as a dominant force in world politics. This period marked a departure from the nation's traditional isolationist stance and laid the foundation for America's involvement in global conflicts and its eventual role as a superpower in the 20th century. The Spanish-American War of 1898 was the first major conflict that propelled the U.S. into the ranks of world powers. Following a quick victory over Spain, the United States acquired territories such as Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, establishing itself as an imperial power. The war also marked a shift in American foreign policy, from a focus on continental expansion to a more outward-looking approach. The U.S. began to take a more active role in world affairs, engaging in diplomacy and forming strategic alliances to protect its interests. In the early years of the 20th century, President Theodore Roosevelt championed the idea of a more assertive American foreign policy. His famous phrase, "Speak softly and carry a big stick," reflected his belief that military power should complement diplomacy. Roosevelt's leadership in negotiating the end of the Russo-Japanese War in 1905 earned the U.S. the Nobel Peace Prize and demonstrated America's growing influence in international diplomacy. Additionally, the construction of the Panama Canal, completed in 1914, reinforced the U.S.'s strategic importance in global trade and military positioning. However, America's rise as a global power was not without controversy. The annexation of the Philippines and the subsequent Philippine-American War highlighted the contradictions of American imperialism, as the U.S. struggled to reconcile its democratic ideals with its actions in the territories it acquired. The debate over imperialism divided the nation, with some arguing that the U.S. should spread democracy and others decrying the hypocrisy of controlling overseas colonies while professing to be a champion of self-determination. World War I marked another turning point in America's role on the world stage. Initially hesitant to enter the conflict, the U.S. eventually joined the war in 1917, tipping the balance in favor of the Allies. President Woodrow Wilson's idealistic vision for a post-war world, encapsulated in his 14 points, called for the establishment of the League of Nations, an international organization designed to promote peace and cooperation. Although the U.S. did not ultimately join the League, Wilson's efforts marked the beginning of the United States' involvement in shaping global affairs in the 20th century. By the end of World War I, America had firmly established itself as a major global power, and its influence would continue to grow throughout the century. The early years of the 1900s set the stage for the United States to play a central role in world events, one that would have lasting impacts on both domestic and international affairs. The Great Depression and New Deal. The Great Depression was the most severe economic crisis in American history, beginning with the stock market crash of 1929 and continuing throughout the 1930s. It was a period of mass unemployment, widespread poverty, and economic instability. The crash, often symbolized by Black Tuesday, marked the collapse of a decade of speculative investments and reckless banking practices. As stock prices plummeted, people lost their life savings, banks failed, and millions of Americans found themselves without jobs or hope for the future. By 1933, about 1/4 of the nation's workforce was unemployed, and the economy had contracted drastically. The effects of the Depression were felt throughout American society. Industrial production fell sharply, wages plummeted, and thousands of businesses shuttered their doors. Farmers, who had already been struggling due to the Dust Bowl, faced even greater hardships as crop prices fell and the land became unproductive. Families were displaced and communities were devastated. The economic collapse also brought with it a collapse of confidence in the American capitalist system, as many believed that the government and financial institutions had failed them. In response to the crisis, Franklin D. Roosevelt, elected president in 1932, introduced a series of programs and reforms known as the New Deal. Roosevelt's approach was rooted in the belief that the federal government had a responsibility to intervene in the economy and provide relief to those suffering from the Depression. The New Deal aimed to provide immediate relief, foster economic recovery, and reform the financial system to prevent future crises. The New Deal included a wide range of programs and agencies designed to address different aspects of the economic collapse. The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, and the Works Progress Administration, WPA, put millions of unemployed Americans to work on public projects like building infrastructure, parks, and roads. The Social Security Act of 1935 created a safety net for the elderly, unemployed, and disabled, laying the groundwork for the modern welfare state. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, was established to protect depositors' savings and restore trust in the banking system. Although the New Deal did not fully end the Great Depression, it provided critical relief and laid the foundation for future economic recovery. Roosevelt's leadership and the programs he introduced fundamentally changed the role of the federal government in American life, expanding its reach into areas like social welfare, labor rights, and the regulation of the economy. The New Deal reshaped American society and politics, creating a legacy of government intervention that would shape the nation for decades to come. War efforts and global influence. World War II marked a pivotal moment in both American history and global politics. When the war began in 1939, the United States initially maintained a policy of neutrality, determined to avoid entanglement in another European conflict. However, as the war escalated and threats to global stability increased, the U.S. could not remain on the sidelines. The attack on Pearl Harbor by Japan on December 7, 1941, changed everything. The following day, the United States declared war on Japan, and soon after, Germany and Italy declared war on the U.S., pulling the nation fully into the conflict. America's entry into the war mobilized the country in ways never before seen. The U.S. quickly transitioned from a peacetime economy to a wartime economy. Factories were converted to produce military goods, and millions of men and women enlisted in the armed forces. The government implemented rationing, encouraged war bonds, and launched propaganda campaigns to support the war effort. The economy surged as jobs became plentiful, and unemployment, which had been high during the Great Depression, vanished. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking on roles traditionally reserved for men, while African Americans also found new opportunities in war industries, though racial inequality remained a significant issue. On the battlefield, the United States played a crucial role in both the European and Pacific theaters of war. In Europe, American forces helped turn the tide against Nazi Germany, providing critical support to the Allied invasion of Normandy in 1944, known as D-Day. As the war progressed, U.S. forces pushed into German-occupied Europe, eventually leading to the surrender of Nazi Germany in May 1945. In the Pacific, the U.S. engaged in a brutal island-hopping campaign against Japan, culminating in the use of atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. This marked the end of the war in the Pacific and Japan's surrender. The war had profound effects on America's global influence. The United States emerged as a superpower, both militarily and economically, and it played a central role in shaping the post-war world order. The establishment of the United Nations in 1945 marked a new era of international cooperation, with the U.S. taking a leading role in fostering diplomacy and rebuilding war-torn nations. The Marshall Plan, an American initiative to aid European recovery, solidified the U.S.'s position as a global leader and began a period of unprecedented American influence on the world stage. World War II not only reshaped international relations, but also marked the beginning of the Cold War, a new era of geopolitical tension between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Chapter 7: Modern Struggles and Dreams. In the post-World War II era, the United States found itself at the forefront of global politics, economics, and culture. The nation had emerged from the war as a superpower, but it also faced new challenges that would shape its future. While the U.S. led efforts in international diplomacy, reconstruction, and economic growth, the country was also dealing with internal struggles over issues of race, civil rights, and the shifting social fabric. The promises of prosperity and equality were not equally shared, and many Americans began to demand change in response to ongoing injustices. The Civil Rights Movement, which gained momentum in the 1950s and 1960s, was one of the most significant struggles of the era. African Americans, who had been systematically oppressed through segregation and disenfranchisement, fought for equality under the law. Landmark events such as the 1963 March on Washington and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 symbolized a turning point in American society. Figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Rosa Parks became symbols of the fight for justice and equality, and their efforts led to major legislative changes, including the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Yet despite these advances, racial inequality and tension persisted, with many communities still grappling with poverty, discrimination, and police brutality. Alongside the civil rights movement, women also began to push for greater social and political rights. The feminist movement of the 1960s and 1970s sought to challenge traditional gender roles and secure equal opportunities for women in the workplace, education, and politics. The publication of Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique in 1963 highlighted the frustrations of suburban housewives and sparked a broader conversation about women's roles in society. This era saw the formation of organizations like the National Organization for Women, NOW, which advocated for reproductive rights, equal pay, and an end to workplace discrimination. Women gained greater access to higher education and professional careers, though full equality was still a distant goal. The Vietnam War, which escalated in the 1960s, became a focal point for political and social division. Anti-war protests, particularly among younger generations, highlighted the growing divide between the government and the American people. The war's unpopularity and the graphic media coverage of the conflict contributed to widespread skepticism about government authority and military intervention. The war not only cost thousands of American lives, but also marked a period of political turmoil and disillusionment. Throughout the late 20th and early 21st centuries, America faced increasing challenges in balancing its ideals of freedom, democracy, and equality with the realities of economic inequality, social unrest, and political polarization. Yet, the nation also experienced remarkable achievements, from technological advancements in space exploration to the growth of the information age. These struggles and dreams have defined modern America as the country continues to confront the complexities of race, gender, and class, while striving to live up to its founding ideals. The ongoing pursuit of justice, equality, and opportunity remains a central theme in the nation's story. Civil rights and social change. The civil rights movement of the mid-20th century was one of the most transformative periods in American history, as it sought to end racial segregation, discrimination, and disenfranchisement. While the movement was primarily focused on securing equal rights for African Americans, it also sparked broader social change, challenging the nation's deeply ingrained racial and social structures. This era, spanning from the 1950s through the 1970s, witnessed a combination of legal battles, protests, and civil disobedience, ultimately leading to significant legislative and societal changes. The struggle for civil rights began to gain momentum in the 1950s. Landmark events, such as the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court decision, which declared racial segregation in public schools unconstitutional, provided a legal foundation for further challenges to segregation. Despite this victory, many Southern states resisted integration, forcing African Americans to continue their fight for equality. In 1955, the arrest of Rosa Parks for refusing to give up her seat on a segregated bus in Montgomery, Alabama, sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, which became one of the first large-scale organized protests against segregation. The boycott, led by Martin Luther King Jr., marked the beginning of a mass movement that would define the civil rights era. The 1960s saw the movement expand, with protests and acts of civil disobedience challenging segregation and discrimination in every aspect of public life, from schools to restaurants and voting booths. The 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where King delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech, symbolized the unity and determination of African Americans and their allies. The movement gained national attention and put pressure on the federal government to act. The result was the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which aimed to eliminate barriers to voting, especially in the South. While these laws were a major victory, they did not immediately end racial inequality. Many African Americans, particularly in the North, still face discrimination in housing, employment, and education. In the late 1960s, the rise of the Black Power movement, led by figures such as Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael, reflected growing frustration with the pace of change and a shift toward more radical approaches. The movement also gave birth to new forms of African American identity, emphasizing pride, self-determination, and a rejection of assimilation into white society. Alongside the African American civil rights movement, other social movements emerged, including the women's liberation movement, which sought equal rights for women in education, employment, and reproductive rights. The struggle for gender equality intersected with the civil rights movement, with activists like Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem advocating for women's rights. These movements challenged long-held norms and expanded the definition of freedom, pushing the nation toward a more inclusive society. The civil rights movement was not just about legal victories, but also about social change. It forced the country to confront its racial prejudices and social inequalities, igniting conversations about justice and equality that continue today. While significant progress has been made, the movement highlighted the ongoing need for social, political, and economic equality, continuing to influence movements for racial justice and civil rights in the years that followed. Political shifts and culture wars. The late 20th century and early 21st century in the United States were marked by significant political shifts and intense cultural battles that shaped the nation's political landscape. The country faced a period of ideological realignment as the divisions between the left and right became more pronounced and issues of race, religion, gender, and morality dominated national discourse. This era saw the rise of a more conservative political movement driven by figures like Ronald Reagan, while also witnessing the continued push for progressivism in areas like civil rights, women's rights, and LGBTQ+ issues. The 1980s marked a significant political shift with the election of Ronald Reagan as president in 1980. Reagan, representing the Republican Party, championed a conservative agenda that emphasized small government, deregulation, and tax cuts for the wealthy. His presidency signaled the rise of neoliberalism, which favored free market policies, a reduction in social welfare programs, and a strong stance against the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Reagan's message of restoring American values resonated with many, particularly in the heartland, and his policies ushered in a new era of conservative dominance in American politics. At the same time, the 1980s also saw the rise of the religious right, with figures like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson gaining political influence. These leaders, who represented conservative Christian views, played a crucial role in shaping the Republican Party's platform, particularly on issues such as abortion, school prayer, and LGBTQ+ rights. The moral majority they represented sought to influence politics in line with traditional Christian values, marking a cultural divide in the country that would continue to evolve in the years to come. The 1990s and early 2000s saw the continuation of political polarization. The Bill Clinton presidency, which introduced a more moderate Democratic approach, was often at odds with the conservative push for deregulation and tax cuts. The debate over government spending, welfare reform, and issues such as the impeachment of Clinton over the Monica Lewinsky scandal reflected the deepening cultural divisions between the political left and right. Simultaneously, the cultural wars, a term that referred to the ideological conflicts over issues like abortion, gun rights, and LGBTQ+ rights, intensified. The battle for gay rights, in particular, reached a new level of visibility, with the push for marriage equality becoming a major topic of discussion. Meanwhile, debates over race, immigration, and identity politics gained national prominence, especially in the wake of events like the Rodney King riots and the election of the first African American president, Barack Obama, in 2008. These political shifts and cultural battles highlighted the nation's struggle to reconcile its core ideals of freedom and equality with the realities of changing demographics and evolving social values. The culture wars underscored the growing divide between progressive and conservative ideologies, a divide that continues to shape American politics today. The debates over what it means to be an American and who gets to define the nation's values remain ongoing, reflecting the dynamic and often contentious nature of American democracy. You have been listening to The America We Knew, The Evolution of a Nation, written by Harry Montgomery, narrated by Cedar Reyes,